If the desert ever goes silent, it's because it's hiding something it doesn't want you to find. The wind moved low across the Arizona training zone, carrying heat instead of comfort, as if the ground itself was breathing out exhaustion after a long-forgotten day. Somewhere beyond the broken line of faded military markers and cracked sandstone ridges, a single figure stood completely still. Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole had learned over 12 years of service that silence was never empty. It was always waiting for something to reveal itself. At his side, a white German Shepherd K9 named Blizzard did not move like other dogs. He moved like a decision already made. His fur reflected the harsh desert light, almost glowing against the burnt orange earth, and his amber eyes were locked forward, not scanning, but focusing as if the world had narrowed into a single point beneath the ground. Marcus adjusted his gloves, feeling the dry air press against his skin like fine dust trying to settle into every seam of his uniform. The mission briefing had been simple. Survey the abandoned trench line 3 miles east of Echo Ridge. Confirm structural stability. Report any anomalies. But nothing about this place felt simple. The trench itself stretched like a scar through the desert floor, uneven and half-collapsed, as if the land had tried to erase it but never fully succeeded. Every step Marcus took near it felt heavier, the ground slightly softer, the kind of soil that remembered pressure. Blizzard suddenly stopped. No command had been given, no signal exchanged. The dog's posture shifted subtly, ears angled forward, body rigid but not aggressive, more like he was listening to something beneath the world rather than above it. Marcus followed his gaze down into the trench. At first there was nothing but still earth, scattered rock, and a faint shimmer of heat distortion rising from the sand. Then came the smallest detail, almost too subtle to trust, a faint unevenness in the surface, like air pushing back from below where it shouldn't. Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Blizzard," he said quietly, voice low and steady, more habit than instruction. The K9 did not respond with movement, only intensified focus, stepping closer to the edge without hesitation, planting his paws firmly, as if anchoring himself to something unseen. The desert breeze picked up for a moment, brushing against Marcus's sleeves, carrying a distant metallic scent from old equipment buried long ago. He had walked battlefields before, he had seen what silence followed chaos, but this was different. This silence felt aware. Blizzard let out a soft exhale, not a bark, not a warning, something more restrained, as if he was holding back noise out of respect for what lay below. Marcus lowered himself slightly, eyes scanning the trench floor again. That was when he noticed it, a subtle shift in the sand near a collapsed section, almost imperceptible unless the light hit it just right. It wasn't movement in the open air, it was pressure beneath it, a resistance that shouldn't have been there. He stood still for a long moment, weighing training against instinct, procedure against something he could not yet name. Blizzard took one step forward, then another, stopping exactly at a point where the ground dipped slightly inward. He lowered his head, not touching the earth, just hovering above it, as if acknowledging something fragile below. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest, not fear, but recognition of something urgent without explanation. The radio on his vest crackled faintly with static from the distant command post, but he didn't respond. His attention was no longer on protocol. It was on the space between breaths, on the fragile possibility that the desert was not as empty as it appeared. Blizzard remained perfectly still, eyes fixed downward, as if guarding something that had not yet decided whether to stay in this world. The moment stretched longer than logic usually allowed, as if the desert itself had paused to observe what the white K9 was sensing beneath its surface, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole remained still beside Blizzard, feeling the weight of a decision that had not yet been spoken aloud but was already forming between instinct and duty. The radio on his vest crackled again, this time more insistent, carrying the voice of command from the temporary field station, nearly 3 miles away, asking for a status update on trench line Echo Ridge sector. Yet Marcus did not respond immediately because Blizzard had begun to move in a slow, deliberate pattern along the edge of the trench, stepping with precision that suggested not curiosity but certainty, stopping twice at nearly identical points in the ground, as if marking invisible coordinates that only he could perceive. And Marcus followed him carefully, boots pressing into dry soil that gave slightly under. Pressure, a reminder that this land had been disturbed long before they arrived. The desert wind shifted again, carrying heat waves that blurred the horizon into soft distortion. And in that distortion, Marcus thought he saw a faint irregularity in the trench wall, a section where the sand had compacted differently, forming a subtle curve rather than a natural collapse. And it was there that Blizzard finally lowered his head closer to the ground, not touching it, but hovering just above it. Breathing slowly as if listening to something alive beneath layers of earth and silence. Marcus crouched slightly, placing one hand near the edge without crossing into it, and spoke softly into his radio, requesting a brief pause in command instructions due to a possible subsurface anomaly, though he did not yet have the language to fully explain what he was witnessing, because nothing in his training manuals accounted for AK-9 refusing all external command to guard a specific point in empty terrain. Behind him, the distant hum of a utility vehicle approached and stopped, followed by footsteps of another Marine, Lieutenant Daniel Hayes, a man assigned to oversee perimeter safety for the operation, who called out asking if everything was normal, but Marcus raised a single hand without looking back, signaling for silence. And for a brief moment, even the wind seemed to lower its voice. Blizzard shifted again, this time scratching lightly at a precise spot in the sand, not aggressively, but with controlled urgency, and Marcus knelt beside him, placing his hand on the ground where the K9 indicated, feeling the faintest vibration through his fingertips, not sound, not movement on the surface, but something deeper, like pressure trapped beneath layers that had settled too quickly. The realization formed slowly in Marcus's mind, not as alarm, but as concern, because this kind of signal often meant structural collapse beneath abandoned terrain, possibly remnants of an old support trench or forgotten maintenance channel that had weakened over time. And yet there was something else layered beneath that explanation, something that made Blizzard refuse to leave his position. Lieutenant Hayes stepped closer but stopped at a respectful distance when he saw the dog's posture, because experienced handlers recognized when AK-9 was not reacting to environment but to presence. And Hayes lowered his voice asking if Marcus wanted engineering support on site. But Marcus only nodded slightly, without taking his eyes off Blizzard, who now stood perfectly still again, gaze locked downward as if maintaining contact with something fragile and unseen. The air felt heavier now, not with heat alone, but with anticipation, as if the desert was holding its breath alongside them. And Marcus made a decision that went against standard procedure, but aligned perfectly with trust built over years of shared missions with his K9 partner, signaling for a careful manual inspection rather than mechanical intervention, because something about Blizzard's behavior suggested precision sensitivity that machines might miss. Slowly, Marcus retrieved a compact toolkit from his vest, kneeling beside the trench, while maintaining a respectful distance from the unstable edge, and as he worked, Blizzard remained positioned like a sentinel, never moving his gaze, never breaking focus, as though guarding time itself. The trench seemed unchanged to any passing observer, just another scar in an abandoned desert training sector. Yet within that silence there was a growing certainty in Marcus's chest that this was not simply a geological irregularity, and as the sun shifted slightly lower in the sky casting longer shadows across the broken ground, the connection between man and K9 deepened into something unspoken but absolute, a shared understanding that whatever lay beneath them was not meant to remain undiscovered much longer. The desert light had shifted into a deeper angle now, stretching long shadows across the fractured trench like dark ribbons laid over ancient stone, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole could feel the situation changing in a way that was no longer theoretical but increasingly real, because Blizzard had stopped pacing and was now holding a single fixed position at the lowest point of the disturbed ground, his entire body aligned as if he had drawn an invisible boundary that no one else was allowed to ignore. Marcus lowered himself further, one knee pressing into the warm sand, and for the first time since arriving at the site he removed his gloves, letting his bare hand hover just above the surface where Blizzard was focused. And there it was again, that subtle irregularity, not movement on the surface but something deeper, like a delayed response from beneath layers of compressed earth, something that did not belong to the stillness of an abandoned training sector. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes had moved closer now, maintaining a careful distance but clearly aware that whatever was unfolding required attention beyond standard inspection protocol. And his voice came lower than before as he asked Marcus if he wanted a full emergency support request initiated. But Marcus did not answer immediately because Blizzard had shifted his posture once more, this time lowering his head and exhaling slowly through his nose in a controlled pattern that Marcus had only seen in moments of extreme focus during previous missions. And that memory tightened something in Marcus's chest because he recognized what it meant when Blizzard stopped reacting to environment and started reacting to presence. The radio on Marcus's vest crackled again, this time with a more urgent tone, requesting confirmation of trench stability and reminding him of the scheduled sweep completion window. But Marcus reached down and muted the channel without speaking, choosing instead to trust what he could see and what he could feel through the ground itself. The desert wind rose briefly, carrying dust across the trench in thin waves, and in that moment Blizzard shifted one more time, not aggressively but with deliberate precision, placing his paw near a compacted section of soil that appeared slightly darker than the surrounding earth, as if it had absorbed pressure differently over time. And Marcus leaned closer, brushing away a thin layer of sand with careful movement, revealing a faint indentation that suggested collapse rather than formation, a subtle pocket where the ground had given way and then sealed itself again. Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward another pace, now visibly focused, and asked if Marcus believed there could be a subsurface void or structural cavity beneath them. And Marcus nodded slowly, still not taking his eyes off Blizzard, because the dog had not moved since indicating that exact location. And his stillness carried more certainty than any instrument they had brought into the field. Marcus activated a small handheld sensor from his kit, placing it near the marked area, and waited as the device scanned the silence between each electronic pulse, stretching longer than it should have, until finally a faint fluctuation registered, not strong enough to confirm structure, but consistent enough to suggest irregular air displacement below the surface. And that single reading changed the tone of everything around them. Blizzard responded instantly to the change, lifting his head slightly and shifting his weight forward, as if acknowledging that confirmation had finally aligned with instinct. And Marcus felt a quiet shift in his understanding of the situation, because this was no longer just an anomaly in terrain, but a signal that something beneath the desert had created its own fragile balance with the space above it. Lieutenant Hayes immediately requested engineering and medical standby through his radio, voice now steady but urgent, while Marcus began carefully widening the inspection area by hand, removing layers of sand with controlled movements to avoid destabilizing the trench wall, each motion deliberate and measured, guided by the understanding that whatever lay beneath required patience more than speed. Blizzard remained positioned at the edge of the exact point he had chosen, not moving, not reacting to anything outside. That singular focus. And Marcus noticed for the first time that the dog's breathing had slowed to a rhythm that mirrored concentration rather than alertness, as if he was maintaining a connection with something that had not yet fully broken the surface of awareness. The minutes stretched, marked only by distant wind and the faint hum of approaching support vehicles far off beyond the ridge, and Marcus paused briefly to listen, lowering his head closer to the ground. And in that silence he thought he heard it, not clearly enough to define but enough to question whether it was real, a faint inconsistency in the stillness that suggested life continuing beneath layers of compressed earth and forgotten time. Blizzard responded immediately to Marcus's subtle shift in posture, stepping half a pace forward and then stopping again, holding that position with unwavering certainty, and Marcus exhaled slowly, realizing that the situation had reached a threshold where instinct and evidence were beginning to align, where what the K9 sensed and what the environment suggested were no longer separate interpretations, but part of the same unfolding reality. The desert sun dipped lower behind the distant ridge line, casting a cooler hue across the trench, and as shadows deepened, Marcus made the decision to request full extraction and support deployment to the exact coordinates. Not because he had confirmed what lay beneath, but because everything he had learned over years of service told him that when silence behaved like this, it was never empty. It was always protecting something worth reaching for. The request for full support had already been sent, but in the desert there is always a delay between what is called for and what arrives. And during that gap, Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole found himself standing in a silence that felt heavier than before, as if the land itself had begun to acknowledge the attention now focused on it. Blizzard remained at the exact same point near the trench edge, unwavering, his white coat reflecting the fading sunlight in a way that made him appear almost carved from the environment rather than placed inside it, and Marcus could feel the tension in that stillness building, not as fear but as expectation, the kind of anticipation that comes before something hidden decides whether it will remain hidden. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes had stepped back slightly now, speaking into his radio with controlled urgency as he confirmed coordinates for support units, engineering teams, and medical standby. His voice steady but carrying an edge that only appears when routine procedure begins to turn into something less predictable, while Marcus continued to focus on the ground in front of Blizzard, carefully clearing away small sections of sand by hand, exposing subtle variations in density that suggested more than natural erosion. The desert wind softened briefly, and in that moment the entire trench seemed to quiet further, as if even the environment was waiting for confirmation of what was being sensed. And Marcus noticed that Blizzard had changed his posture again, this time lowering himself closer to the ground without lying down, his body aligned with the trench line in a way that mirrored protection rather than search, as though he had assumed responsibility for something that had not yet fully revealed itself. Marcus glanced toward Lieutenant Hayes and gave a short nod, signaling that the situation required no further escalation in words but complete readiness in presence, and Hayes responded by positioning himself further back to maintain a clear perimeter, eyes scanning the surrounding desert for any secondary hazards, while the radio traffic in Marcus's ear continued in distant fragments of acknowledgement and deployment confirmation. Then, something subtle shifted beneath Marcus's hand as he pressed lightly against the sand, a faint compression that felt different from the surrounding ground, not unstable in the way of collapse but distinct in texture, like air held in a space that should not exist, and he paused, holding his breath without realizing it. Blizzard reacted instantly to that pause, lifting his head slightly and focusing more intently on the exact point Marcus was touching, reinforcing the sense that this was not random detection but precise awareness, and Marcus felt a steadying clarity settle over his thoughts because the pattern was no longer isolated. It was consistent, repeated, and deliberately centered beneath Blizzard's position. The sun continued its descent, shifting the color of the desert from harsh gold to deeper amber, and shadows from the trench edges stretched inward, narrowing the visible space between surface and depth, while Marcus carefully expanded the cleared area by another few inches, revealing a faint outline that suggested a hollow beneath compacted earth, not large enough to be immediately visible, but enough to confirm irregular structure. Lieutenant Hayes approached again, stopping at a distance that respected both procedure and instinct, and asked quietly if Marcus believed there was a risk of full structural collapse if they continued. And Marcus considered the question carefully before responding that the ground felt more like a sealed void than an unstable surface, meaning pressure was contained rather than spreading, a distinction that changed the nature of the concern entirely. Blizzard shifted once more, placing his paw directly beside Marcus's hand, and for a brief moment both man and K9 were aligned in the same focus point, looking down at the same invisible boundary between known terrain and unknown depth, and Marcus felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not from uncertainty, but from recognition that whatever lay beneath had likely been there long enough to become part of the landscape's silence. The distant sound of approaching vehicles grew slightly more distinct now, still far but closing, and the desert air carried a faint vibration that suggested movement across open terrain. Yet within the trench itself, everything remained focused on that single point of anomaly. Marcus lowered his voice and spoke almost to himself, noting the precise location for incoming teams, while Blizzard remained completely still, eyes fixed downward, as if maintaining contact with something that had not yet decided to surface. And in that shared stillness between man, animal, and desert, the sense of urgency transformed into something more precise and unspoken, the understanding that the next moments would determine whether the silence beneath them would remain sealed or finally be allowed to breathe. The desert had begun to change its tone, shifting from the harsh brightness of midday into a deeper, more muted color as the sun lowered toward the distant ridge line, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole could feel the weight of waiting settle across the trench like a second layer of dust, because even though support units had been confirmed en route, there was still a gap between arrival and certainty, a space where only observation and trust could operate. Blizzard remained locked at the same position without hesitation, his white coat now faintly tinted by the warm light of sunset, standing like a fixed point in a shifting world, and Marcus stayed close beside him, one knee still pressed into the sand, his attention divided between the subtle irregularity beneath the ground and the steady discipline of the K-9 who refused to move away from it. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes had taken a position several yards back, maintaining visual coverage of the surrounding terrain while continuing to relay updates through his radio, his voice now joined by distant confirmations of incoming engineering and medical support vehicles, their estimated arrival time measured in minutes rather than uncertainty. Yet even that knowledge did not reduce the quiet tension growing inside the trench. Marcus carefully extended his hand again to the surface, brushing away another thin layer of sand, and the texture beneath felt slightly different, more compact in some areas and unexpectedly hollow in others, as if the ground had settled unevenly around a void that resisted natural explanation, and he paused for a moment, allowing himself to fully register the inconsistency before continuing. Blizzard reacted immediately to the pause, shifting his head a few inches closer, eyes fixed on the same point Marcus was examining, reinforcing once again that his focus was not random but anchored to something precise beneath the surface. And Marcus felt a growing sense of alignment between instinct and evidence, a rare moment in field operations where both began to support each other instead of compete. The wind passed through the trench in a slow wave, lifting fine dust into the air before letting it settle again. And in that brief movement, Marcus thought he heard something subtle, not a sound in the traditional sense, but a faint variation in the silence, as if the ground itself had a rhythm that did not belong to the open desert above. Lieutenant Hayes called out briefly to confirm that ground teams were now less than 5 minutes out, and Marcus acknowledged without looking away from Blizzard, whose posture had not changed in the slightest, still steady, still focused, still maintaining that unwavering point of attention, as if guarding a boundary between two conditions of existence. Marcus shifted slightly forward and widened the cleared area by another careful sweep of his hand, revealing a more defined contour beneath the sand, a shape that suggested compression rather than collapse. And that distinction carried weight in his mind because it implied something had once been intentionally covered or protected rather than simply buried by chance. He glanced briefly toward Hayes and gave a quiet signal to maintain distance and readiness, then returned his focus to the trench floor where Blizzard now stood directly over the most sensitive point, his stance firm but calm, projecting a presence that felt less like alertness and more like confirmation. The desert light continued to soften, casting long angular shadows across the trench walls that shifted slowly with every passing minute, and Marcus noticed how those shadows seemed to converge toward the same central point, as if the environment itself was drawing attention to what lay beneath. The approaching sound of engines grew slightly clearer now, still distant but undeniable, and Marcus took a slow breath, steadying himself as he considered the next step in protocol, knowing that whatever the teams would uncover, it would begin exactly where Blizzard had chosen to stand without hesitation, and in that realization there was a quiet understanding forming between man and K-9, one built not on instruction or command, but on the rare certainty that sometimes instinct arrives before explanation and remains long after words become necessary. The sound of approaching engines grew steadily clearer now, no longer a distant suggestion, but a physical presence moving across the open desert, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole straightened slightly in the trench as the first support vehicle crested the ridge line, its tires cutting through sand in slow, controlled motion, followed by another and then a third, forming a staggered line that signaled engineering and medical teams arriving exactly as requested. The desert air shifted with the disturbance of movement, dust rising in thin curtains before settling again, and Blizzard remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, positioned over the same precise point beneath the trench, his white coat illuminated by the fading sunlight in a way that made him appear almost unreal against the grounded texture of earth and sand. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes raised an arm to guide the incoming teams into a safe staging position, his voice now more structured as he coordinated spacing and approach angles, ensuring no heavy equipment would enter the immediate trench perimeter until a full assessment was complete, and Marcus watched carefully as the engineers dismounted, carrying compact diagnostic tools and ground sensors designed for subsurface detection. There was a brief exchange of acknowledgments, standard procedural confirmations, but beneath the formal structure there was an unmistakable shift in energy, the kind that occurs when experienced personnel recognize that a situation has moved beyond routine inspection. Marcus stepped forward to meet the lead engineer, a calm and focused specialist who immediately began surveying the trench line and reviewing Marcus's earlier markings, while Blizzard remained unmoving, maintaining his position as though it were a fixed coordinate rather than a choice. And more than one member of the arriving team glanced toward the K-9 with quiet curiosity, noting his unwavering focus. The engineers deployed a lightweight ground scanning unit, placing it carefully near the area Blizzard had indicated, and within moments the device emitted a soft sequence of measured signals that translated into fluctuating readings on the handheld display, showing irregular density beneath the surface consistent with a hollow space rather than uniform ground. Marcus observed the data without speaking, allowing the confirmation to settle naturally, and Lieutenant Hayes leaned in slightly to review the output before nodding once, acknowledging that the anomaly was no longer theoretical but structurally supported. Still, there was hesitation, not doubt but caution, because the nature of subsurface voids in abandoned desert training zones could vary widely, and procedure required precise verification before any further action. Blizzard shifted for the first time in several minutes, not moving away but adjusting his stance by a fraction, as if aligning himself more precisely with the point of interest, and Marcus noticed that the K-9's breathing remained slow and controlled, a steady rhythm that mirrored the calm focus of the entire operation despite the increasing complexity of the situation. The lead engineer marked a secondary scan point and began a refined sweep across the trench floor, moving in a grid pattern while maintaining constant communication with the handheld unit. And as the readings stabilized, a clearer outline began to form on the display, suggesting a contained space beneath approximately 6 to 8 feet of compacted soil. Marcus exhaled slowly, absorbing the confirmation without breaking focus, because even with technical validation, the significance of Blizzard's behavior remained central to everything unfolding. Lieutenant Hayes instructed the perimeter team to widen the secured area slightly to allow safe maneuvering of equipment, and the instruction was carried out with quiet efficiency, boots pressing into the sand as personnel adjusted positions without disrupting the focal point of the trench. Blizzard remained unwavering, eyes fixed downward, and Marcus felt again that same subtle alignment between instinct and data, as if both were converging on a shared truth rather than separate interpretations. The desert light continued to fade, transitioning into a cooler tone that softened the harsh contrast of the terrain, and shadows extended further into the trench, gradually enclosing the central area. Where attention was concentrated, the engineers prepared a low-impact probing tool designed for careful penetration of compacted layers without destabilizing surrounding ground, and Marcus watched as it was positioned with extreme precision, the operator pausing briefly to confirm coordinates before initiating the first controlled test insertion. Blizzard did not react to the tool itself, only to the exact location it targeted, maintaining his focus as if confirming that the alignment was correct. Marcus placed one hand lightly on the edge of the trench, steadying himself as he observed the final preparations, aware that what came next would determine the nature of everything they had been sensing from the beginning. And in the quiet that followed the movement of men and machines, there remained a single constant point of certainty in the white K-9 standing guard over what lay beneath, as if holding the line between the known surface world and something carefully preserved below. The desert had fully transitioned into the quiet phase of late evening, where light no longer felt direct but instead diffused across the landscape in long fading gradients. And Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole stood at the edge of the trench observing, as the engineering team completed the final calibration of their probing equipment. Each movement precise and deliberate as the atmosphere around them tightened into focused anticipation. Blizzard had not moved from his original position, still guarding the exact point beneath the surface with an unwavering stillness that now felt less like observation and more like protection, as if he understood that what lay beneath required careful respect rather than forceful discovery. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes maintained perimeter coordination, while the lead engineer initiated a controlled insertion of the probing sensor into the compacted ground, the device descending slowly with measured resistance, its readings transmitted in real time to the handheld monitor that Marcus watched closely without blinking. For several seconds, nothing changed, only static consistency across the display, but then a subtle fluctuation appeared, a shift in density that broke the uniform pattern of the surrounding soil layers, and the engineer paused, adjusting the angle of insertion by mere degrees before continuing with even greater caution. Marcus felt the tension in the group rise slightly, not through panic but through collective focus, because every experienced member of the team recognized that this kind of signal did not occur in random terrain without cause. Blizzard responded by lowering his head just slightly, maintaining alignment with the exact location of the sensor, his posture unchanged yet deeply attentive, and Marcus found himself mirroring that stillness, grounded in the same point of awareness. The engineer reported a confirmed irregular cavity, shallow at first measurement, but extending further beneath the trench floor, its boundaries uneven but clearly defined enough to suggest a naturally or partially formed void rather than simple erosion. Lieutenant Hayes relayed the updated status to incoming support units, his tone calm, but carrying a subtle urgency that reflected the importance of precision in the next steps. Marcus stepped closer to the marked area, crouching beside Blizzard, and placed his hand gently on the sand once again, feeling the faintest variation in temperature and resistance, as though the ground itself was layered with something that disrupted uniformity. There was no sound beneath the surface that could be clearly identified. Yet Marcus sensed a continuity in the readings, a consistency that suggested something within the void remained stable despite the pressure above it. Blizzard shifted his weight forward by a fraction, not breaking stance, but reinforcing focus. And Marcus realized that the K9's behavior was not simply reactive but sustained, as if he had been maintaining this awareness long before human tools confirmed it. The engineering team prepared a secondary diagnostic pass, lowering a refined acoustic sensor designed to map internal structures through vibration analysis. And as it activated, a low-frequency pulse spread through the ground, registering back as uneven echoes that confirmed the presence of a contained space beneath approximately 7 feet of compacted earth. Marcus absorbed the information without speaking, allowing the silence to carry its own meaning. Because confirmation did not reduce the importance of caution, it only clarified the direction of attention. Blizzard remained locked in position, eyes fixed downward, his presence steady enough that even the shifting desert wind seemed to move around him rather than through him. And Marcus noticed that several members of the support team had begun to observe the K9 with a different kind of focus. No longer casual curiosity, but measured respect. Lieutenant Hayes ordered a controlled expansion of the survey perimeter to ensure safe conditions for further analysis, and the team responded immediately, adjusting positions while maintaining the integrity of the trench boundary. The sun had now dipped below the ridge line, leaving behind a cooler twilight that softened the harsh contrast of the desert floor, and shadows deepened around the trench edges, gradually enclosing the central area, where all attention was concentrated. Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of convergence between instinct and data reach a point of quiet alignment, because everything they had measured now reflected what Blizzard had indicated from the beginning, without hesitation or deviation. The engineer completed the second scan cycle and confirmed that the cavity remained stable, not expanding or collapsing, suggesting an enclosed space that had maintained structural equilibrium over time. And this detail shifted the entire interpretation of the situation into something more deliberate and less incidental. Marcus looked once more at Blizzard, who had not moved an inch from his original stance, and in that stillness there was a sense of certainty that transcended procedure, a quiet understanding that whatever lay beneath the desert was not simply hidden by chance, but preserved in a way that demanded careful and respectful discovery, as the final preparations for deeper investigation were. Initiated under the fading light of day, the final phase of preparation unfolded under a sky now transitioning into deep twilight, where the desert lost its sharp edges and became a vast gradient of shadow and fading color. And Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole stood at the edge of the trench watching as the engineering team carefully positioned their refined access equipment for a controlled subsurface entry, each movement executed with deliberate precision to avoid disturbing the stabilized ground layers identified in the previous scans. Blizzard remained exactly where he had been since the beginning of the operation, his white coat now dimly glowing under the last traces of ambient light, standing as a fixed and silent guardian over the same point in the trench floor. And Marcus felt that presence not as command or instruction, but as certainty, as if the K-9 had already accepted responsibility for whatever lay beneath the earth. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes coordinated final safety checks, confirming that all personnel were positioned at appropriate distances and that emergency protocols were active in the event of unexpected ground shift, while the lead engineer initiated the final phase of acoustic and visual probing, lowering a reinforced micro-camera system into the narrow access point that had been carefully cleared. The device descended slowly, guided by a stabilizing cable, transmitting real-time imagery that appeared on the portable monitor held by Marcus and the engineering lead, and for several seconds the screen displayed only compacted soil layers, irregular textures, and faint structural variations consistent with a naturally formed cavity. Then the imagery shifted slightly, revealing a more defined interior space, not large but clearly contained, with smoother surfaces than expected for random collapse, suggesting either partial reinforcement or long-term stabilization by environmental conditions. Marcus leaned closer to the display without speaking, his focus absolute, while Blizzard made a subtle adjustment in posture, stepping half a pace forward as if tracking the same unseen point now being revealed through technology rather than instinct. Lieutenant Hayes quietly instructed everyone to maintain silence across the trench, and the surrounding personnel reduced movement immediately, creating an atmosphere where even minor sounds felt amplified by the stillness of the desert night. The camera feed continued its gradual descent, revealing deeper layers of the cavity, and the engineers noted a consistent air pocket signature, stable enough to indicate sustained internal volume rather than recent collapse, a detail that shifted the entire operational context into a more delicate and precise phase. Marcus felt a quiet tightening in his awareness as the data confirmed what Blizzard had indicated from the beginning, yet there was still no rush in his movements, only careful attention, because the integrity of whatever lay beneath required patience above all else. Blizzard remained completely still, eyes fixed downward, his presence now mirrored by several members of the support team who had begun to recognize that his position was not random, but anchored to the most stable point of the entire structure. The engineer adjusted the camera angle slightly, and the feed revealed a subtle change in the cavity floor, a depression that appeared too uniform to be accidental, suggesting either prolonged compression or a deliberate formation that had been preserved over time. Marcus exchanged a brief glance with Lieutenant Hayes, and without words both understood that the situation had moved beyond simple geological assessment into something requiring careful and respectful extraction protocol. The desert night deepened further, and overhead the first faint stars began to appear, contrasting sharply with the artificial illumination now cast by portable field lights around the trench, creating a layered visual field of natural darkness and controlled human focus. Blizzard finally lowered his head closer to the ground, not in exhaustion but in affirmation, as if acknowledging that the hidden space had now been fully located and confirmed. Marcus placed one hand gently on the trench edge, feeling the remaining warmth of the day still lingering in the sand. And as he looked toward the engineers preparing for the final controlled opening sequence, there was a shared understanding across the team that what lay beneath was no longer a question of speculation, but a matter of careful and deliberate unveiling guided equally by technology, discipline, and the unwavering instinct of a white K9 who had never once moved away from the truth beneath the desert floor. The desert had settled into full night now, where the sky above the trench was no longer a fading gradient, but a deep canopy of still darkness scattered with distant stars. And every piece of equipment on the ground seemed sharper under artificial field lighting as Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole stood alongside the engineering team awaiting the final controlled access procedure into the subsurface cavity that had been confirmed moments earlier. Blizzard remained at his position without hesitation, his white coat now softly illuminated by portable floodlights, standing as a constant and unbroken presence over the exact point that had guided every step of the operation from the beginning. And Marcus felt a calm but focused tension settle across the entire team as the lead engineer gave the final readiness confirmation over radio communication. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes positioned himself at the perimeter line, overseeing safety distance and ensuring that all personnel remained clear of the trench edge while the controlled entry tool was carefully lowered into place, designed to create minimal disturbance while allowing a visual and environmental passage into the cavity below. The moment the device breached the final layer of compacted soil, a subtle shift passed through the trench, not violent or sudden, but perceptible in the way silence changes. When something long hidden finally allows contact with the surface world, and Marcus instinctively leaned forward as the live feed on the monitor stabilized. For several seconds the screen showed only dust particles drifting in the artificial light of the probe. Then slowly the interior of the cavity came into full view, revealing a contained space with smoother boundaries than expected, shaped by time and compression rather than collapse. And within that space there was movement, faint at first, almost indistinguishable from shifting dust, until the camera adjusted and confirmed that something was indeed alive beneath the surface. The engineering team grew still, their focus narrowing completely as Marcus stepped closer to the display, eyes locked on the subtle motion within the cavity, and Blizzard responded by lifting his head slightly, his posture shifting for the first time in a way that suggested recognition rather than alert. Lieutenant Hayes called for absolute silence across the trench, and even the faint mechanical hum of equipment seemed to fade into the background as the team collectively witnessed the confirmation of life support conditions within the underground space. The camera angle adjusted again, revealing clearer structure within the cavity, and there, partially sheltered beneath a collapsed section of reinforced material, a figure became visible, covered in dust and still, but breathing, the slow rhythm of survival evident in the faint rise and fall of movement that the equipment now clearly registered. Marcus exhaled slowly, maintaining control of his response as training and discipline guided his actions, while the medical standby team immediately prepared for controlled extraction procedures, their movements precise and coordinated as they approached the trench edge. Blizzard stepped forward one careful pace, then stopped, holding position as if acknowledging that the moment he had guarded without moving had finally reached its resolution, and Marcus placed a steady hand on the edge of the trench, eyes fixed on the live feed as confirmation replaced uncertainty. Lieutenant Hayes coordinated the extraction sequence, ensuring structural stability remained intact while access points were widened gradually to allow safe retrieval. And as the engineers worked, the cavity opened further in controlled increments, revealing more of the enclosed space and the person within it, still conscious, but weakened from prolonged isolation beneath the surface. The air around the trench felt different now, no longer charged with uncertainty, but with focused urgency. And Marcus moved closer to assist the medical team as they prepared stabilization support. For the extraction, Blizzard remained beside him, calm and unwavering, his presence no longer signaling detection but completion, as if his duty had extended beyond discovery into guardianship until the moment help could arrive. Within minutes the access opening reached sufficient size for controlled retrieval, and the medical team carefully guided the process, bringing the survivor into open air under the combined light of field lamps and stars above, where immediate care and stabilization began without delay. Marcus stepped back slightly, giving space to the professionals. Yet his attention remained fixed on the outcome unfolding in front of him, while Blizzard finally relaxed his stance, sitting down beside the trench edge with quiet composure. no longer watching downward but forward, as if accepting that what had been hidden was now safely returned to the surface world. The desert wind moved gently across the site, carrying away the stillness that had defined the night. And for the first time since the operation began, the trench no longer felt like a place of mystery or uncertainty, but like a threshold that had been carefully crossed and respectfully closed, guided by precision, patience, and the unwavering instinct of a white K9 who had never once looked away from the truth beneath the earth.